Our power grid is under attack in Washington state. And I want to discuss the two different methods currently being used to put your ability to live in a modern world with regular electricity at risk. And then I want to discuss what you can do about it. Now, this is a serious topic. Nobody watching this video will escape the impact of our power grid going down or becoming increasingly unreliable in the very near future. However, I do believe we can reduce the potential for this to happen to our community. So let's review the two primary methods currently being used to disrupt or take down our power grid in Washington state. And by the way, one of them is political and one of them is more just practical. Now, this has a serious impact on our neighboring states as well. That includes Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Northern California, and even parts of Utah, Wyoming, and Nevada. You won't escape this problem by moving to a red state. This issue actually impacts all of us. So here are the two methods. Now, first, you've probably seen news stories about physical attacks on power substations and the temporary resulting blackouts that this has caused in some communities around the country. Most notably, a few weeks ago, the media covered the story of physical attacks on two electrical substations in North Carolina's Moore County, which essentially took down the power for about a week for almost 60% of the people who live there. And these were purposeful, malicious, and successful efforts to damage these local substations, putting many families in the dark for, like I said, about a week. Now, the same thing has been happening in Washington and Oregon state for some time now as well. Attacks on substations in Tumwater, Puyallup, Cowlitz County, and in nearby Oregon, and often these attacks have occurred at roughly the same time, kind of in an orchestrated, organized manner. So people have lost power for shorter durations than in North Carolina, but 2022 is the year basically now that we have a new record of more attacks on our electrical grid than have ever been recorded at any time in the past. And so we've had about 106 attacks so far. So I want to discuss this issue in more detail, specifically what I suspect is happening, and then some of the practical things that I believe we can do to be both personally prepared, but also how we can probably stop or deter these types of attacks from happening in the near future. Now, secondly, the other more brazen and political attack on the sustainability and reliability of our power grid that's happening is really a movement that's been cooked up in the ivory towers of our political class and kind of the enviro groups that grift off of government grants. And this mostly appears to be oriented around the movement to destroy the dams, using the excuse of the salmon or the orca whales or whatever convinces rich Seattle billionaires to write checks and get their green image burnished. This is actually a bigger long-term generational threat to our power grid stability in the Pacific Northwest for a variety of reasons, but it also includes a kind of a hodgepodge of political schemes that are used to degrade the effectiveness and the stability of our power grid for generations. And this includes the stupidity of Governor Inslee's vax mandates, policies that basically resulted in firing many experienced linemen who actually do the hard and very dangerous work of maintaining the power lines and this old infrastructure. Some of it's pretty old. So this includes a refusal of both the private utilities and the public utilities to properly invest in infrastructure hardening or modernization. Even when the need is recognized, bureaucratic obstacles are invented to slow the process down or greatly increase the costs. Now, to fully understand the threat that this represents to us in the Pacific Northwest, it's important to understand what type of power grid we have. And I believe almost all of us just take it for granted. I'd rather we protect what we have and then fix what we can before we suddenly all discover just how important reliable, inexpensive power actually is to everything in our daily lives. So as a fifth-generation Washingtonian myself, I'm just like you. I just take it for granted. I shouldn't. But I have. And in preparation for this video, I find that I'm developing a deeper appreciation for the work previous generations did in our state, during my grandfather's era in particular. So to get to where we are today, it would be absurdly tragic to regress into the kind of this future either the anarchist destroyers want to force us basically to trash our power grid, or kind of this utopian regressive greenie vision that the bureaucrats and the political special interests want to impose on us through this Governor Inslee's office and destroying the dams. So 100 years ago in our state, much of the rural areas, they were not electrified at all. That's why my great Uncle Ed Dalby installed this water wheel right here on his property in Union, Washington back in the 1920s so that he could provide some lights and just basic power for a few of his cabins in the Lower Hood Canal. That water wheel still turns, and it's become kind of a tourist attraction right across the street from the Alderbrook Resort today. It's no longer being used to generate power, but it stands as a reminder that it wasn't that long ago when people who wanted the modern conveniences had to be a lot more self-reliant. Now, Washington State is fairly unique in America today. Many people who watch my videos know that I'm a big fan of our state. We've been blessed with natural resources that are the envy of the world, and our political grifter class has done its best in recent years to take this legacy from us. Now, what resources do I refer to? Water, and lots of it. Our annual snowfall in the Cascades and the Olympics it's massive, even in a dry year. And our annual rainfall on the west side of the state is impressive, and especially this time of year, it's even obnoxious at times. I mean, we have big rivers with lots of water running in them. And once previous generations developed the engineering abilities and the construction technologies to actually harness these rivers, they rapidly were able to capture this renewable resource and turn it into inexpensive and predictable power using hydroelectric dams. Now today, approximately 84% of Seattle's power supply comes via this power source, although roughly 66% of all the power in Washington State ends up coming from hydro. And the funny thing is that statistic is a little different depending on which source you look at, but it's roughly in that range. 2/3 plus of all the power in Washington comes from hydro. So this was a rational and logical approach to solving a variety of problems which plagued previous generations in this region with one primary focus solution. Now, instead of the Kent Valley flooding wall to wall, as it actually did in my grandfather's day, when their flower farm would be underwater in Tukwila, the rivers became a predictable flow of water year-round. By the way, if we didn't have the dams on the Green and the Cedar River, much of downtown Renton, Tukwila, Kent, Portland, Puyallup, Auburn, and Sumner would frequently be flooded just like this. Now, Portland didn't flood any longer after the dams were put in, and the major cities and growing populations had an abundance of inexpensive power after that. In fact, the series of dams on the Columbia and the Snake River began producing enough power that our region actually exports power to most states in the nearby West. And there were additional benefits that came with these construction projects. Inexpensive year-round irrigation, particularly in eastern Washington, that radically improved agricultural output in otherwise relatively dry areas. Predictable power supplies at such a volume and low price that many power-intensive industries were actually located nearby, like aluminum smelters for many decades, and more recently, data centers. Now for Seattle, this also produced large reservoirs of clean water, particularly from the Cedar River watershed, and then using the locks on the Columbia River because the dams were installed and the consistent water flow was basically maintained, the process of moving bulk farm goods downriver on barges was safer and more predictable with a controlled year-round water flow. It wasn't perfect. The abundance of water flow also encouraged the development of nuclear power facilities in Washington State, mostly privately funded. And now, as residents of the Tri-Cities area near the Hanford facility know, the only active nuclear plant is actually located in Richland, Washington, and it produces about 10% of our power grid today. The original organization, though, it was called Washington Public Power Supply System, or WHOOPS for short, went essentially bankrupt when they couldn't fund the bonds to complete construction at the time, about early 1980s. And this is why you see nuclear cooling towers to the south near Highway 12 if you ever drive out to Ocean Shores. Now, a little Northwest history lesson here. The light rail crew that I've been critical of for many years, they studied the failure of WHOOPS, and when they decided to now push for their never-ending fiscal black hole on the voters of the state with light rail, they made sure to structure the financing in a way to avoid ever experiencing this same fate. Now, another downside to the dams was the fact that the original impact on salmon was not properly understood. But various developments, including fish ladders, fish farms, and better water flow management, basically became solutions to the habitat problems that were identified. But unfortunately, we seem to be shifting into kind of a Luddite anti-power trend, which politically it's become more focused on reducing the stability and predictability of electricity for us all in the future. En route to this kind of ugly outcome, policies are regularly pushed and implemented, which unnecessarily increase the costs on everything while rewarding parasitical grifters who just appear to profit from the various schemes used to justify these attacks on the future of our power supply. Now, the lefty kind of greeny grifters are mostly the useful idiots in this sad story. I mean, they're used as the shock troops to threaten the politicians and push the agenda. when the first big dam removal was done on the Elwha River in 2011 through 2012, and it was formally completed in 2014. That particular removal was viewed largely as a success. And whatever wasn't successful, it'll just be ignored. And the dam removal tsunami, the political tsunami for this idea, now it's actually picked up steam. So now they want to remove all the other dams, starting with the ones furthest from Seattle, of course. Now, these are generally bad ideas for a variety of reasons. It's not just destroying the resiliency in the power grid, but also destroying the agricultural operations of eastern Washington and destroying the flood control aspects of the existing dam system. But Governor Inslee doesn't care, and neither do his big donors. Neither do the graduates of Evergreen State College, which seems to stuff most of their most unemployable graduates into paid positions in state and local government. Now, this agenda is a problem, but it's one that can be stopped if enough serious attention is paid to the inevitable impacts on the real people who actually live here. On top of the dam removal schemes being pushed by Inslee and these grifters that are hiding behind the salmon and orca whales, there's also the fact that Washington, uniquely alone in the 50 states, has decided to not define hydropower as a renewable. I mean, this is just a political anti-science approach to reality. And while denying science is a convenient approach by the Greenie crew when convenient, the main reason they did this was because they needed an excuse to justify the grifters behind renewable energy projects, mostly involving windmills and solar plants. Now listen, I love solar and windmill power generation as much as the next guy. Our family is an old family cabin actually built by my grandfather and his brother shortly after World War II. It's out on Hood Head. If you live in Jefferson County and you cross the Hood Canal Bridge, you can actually see it there to the north. Now there's no power to that island, and the solar panels that we put on the roof, I think my uncle put them on the roof at the time, they're adequate to keep our cell phone charged and some LED lighting rather than the old propane lights that my grandfather once had. And there's a time and a place for everything. However, when it comes to public power production, as a community, we make choices based on costs, utility, stability, and the reliability. And if wind and solar make sense in this context, then it should be used and justified. It should justify its use by working as promised. If it doesn't, then taxpayers should not be subsidizing it. And frankly, the average people should not be paying far more in power costs today just to keep some inefficient operation limping along. Now, finally, the impact on the integrated power system is likely to get more unstable as we not only appear to have a political scheme to remove the dams, but also a successful effort to shut down all coal-fired power plants in the area. Now, frankly, this doesn't have a huge impact on Washington State, with one exception being the TransAlta facility in Lewis County, not far from where I live. But however, with that facility going away and now the Montana coal-fired power plant out there, those are going to be shut down. There's actually greater pressure on the power grid in the Pacific Northwest than ever before. So these systems are all integrated. You can shut some down, but you need to replace the supply with something, and wind and solar won't consistently do it. And it's really just like playing a game of Jenga. Every time you remove a block, the tower becomes more and more unstable. And I hate to insult children by associating them or making them equivalent to the politicians who run this operation, but that's about as intelligent as they are. So our politicians are kind of corrupt idiots, and the grifter special interests, they're doing their best to enrich themselves using the excuse of orcas or salmon or global climate change, COVID-19, whatever, happens to get cooked up, what at the Department of Ecology and the Evergreen State College. And we need to confront this. Perhaps Seattle voters will have a change of heart when the power goes out on a more frequent basis. Who knows? We'll probably get to find out, unfortunately, soon. However, this gets back to my first concern now, which is related to our power supply in the Pacific Northwest, and that's the vandalism or the direct attacks on these smaller substations that we see occurring in our communities lately. Now, I realize these are happening around the country, but I'll focus, just because I live here, on what's happening just in the Pacific Northwest for now. Here it's my overall concern that this apparently escalating tactic, really the attacks are very difficult to stop. These are often rural or isolated locations, and they're unmanned facilities. There are thousands of them. I mean, they're all over the place. You probably have some where you live. And it's impossible to actually monitor every site. Malicious people, for whatever their stupid political or ideological reasons, whatever they might justify this with, they can certainly shut them down without too much skill or knowledge. Due to the fact that these are appearing organized, at least from my perspective, here's my fear. they appear to be destroying transformers and other basic components, which normally are fairly commonplace to replace. And don't get me wrong, I mean, these are expensive pieces of equipment, but they sometimes do fail with, even now, just with lightning strikes or trees coming down or ice storms, power surges, even just the inconvenient animal in the wrong time. Think of the squirrel that shouldn't have been there. The problem from my perspective, as we discovered during the COVID-19 kind of hysteria and the chaos, is the fact that our supply chains are not as resilient as people once imagined. I've been informed by sources inside the utility companies and the PDs that the supply chain disruptions are serious. Supplies are both limited and they have much longer lead times to replace those pieces of equipment. And unfortunately, a lot of this equipment isn't even made locally any longer. And this means that if this is truly an organized effort, there may be an intentional or unintentional goal of just burning up our nation's supply chain, not just in the Pacific Northwest. And if you do this often enough, you'll eventually get to the point where you can shut down the power grid community by community. Now, this doesn't require a spectacular event or some kind of Hollywood made-for-movie or paperback novel author scenario. It just requires a bunch of dedicated losers willing to do the damage. So let's talk about solutions and what I think you can do about it, and myself as well. And first, I'd encourage you to reach out to your local elected officials, even if they're Democrats and they seem entirely insane with their approach to reality. Still reach out to them and demand that they take this issue seriously. Adam Smith once said that there's a great deal of ruin in a nation, which means that a nation can actually suffer a lot more than people realize before it totally goes under. But he also meant that terrible public policy can cause much of this great ruin. These are political choices that we make, and we don't need to find the worst ones imaginable and then make them policy like the current kind of clown show seems to be intent on doing. So taking out the dams is lunacy. Defining hydropower as non-renewable power is absurd. And perhaps we should be shifting resources at the FBI and other law enforcement agencies towards actually catching the criminals who are trying to take down our power grid, rather than spending their time censoring conservatives on Twitter, Facebook, Google, or trying to harass people for parading without a permit in D.C. That's just a thought. But I'd also like to stop whoever is trying to sabotage our infrastructure at the same time. Now, maybe it's just one of the Antifa crew who decided that it's boring to keep trying to burn down the courthouse in Portland. Or maybe create another basically autonomous zone in Seattle. I mean, been there, done that. Maybe they believe they can just punish us hicks and the sticks who tend to vote conservative. Who knows? Maybe it's just some other crazy anarchist group who thinks it's fun to shift the world into some kind of anarchy. Or maybe it would be just bad guys inspired and funded by a state actor out there who wants Americans to suffer kind of the same power outages that the rest of the world experiences regularly. It really doesn't matter, but we need to stop them, whoever they are. Now, on a more local and practical level, if you live near one of these power substations, I'd suggest making sure that you have a security camera facing the nearby road. And if possible, the station itself, kind of depends on where you happen to live, just to provide documentation in the event of a criminal act that's committed near where you live. And try to have the camera on a power backup supply so you can at least publish what you find. Criminals are often caught this way. They regularly are. There's a reason why police canvass a neighborhood to try to get the neighbors, cameras recordings or ring camera images, because sometimes that's how you find out who's been out there. Make a copy of the video so that you can go public with it if necessary, particularly in case the local federal crew just isn't as serious about catching the bad guys as they're trying to moonlight for Facebook or Google censorship jobs. Now, be prepared to survive at home without power for even a few weeks or even a month. It's not as easy as it sounds, but everyone should be prepared in case that day arrives, because let's face it, our political leadership is mostly clueless. They're spineless at best and distressingly too often completely corrupt at worst. Would you actually trust your family's security to them? It's your choice, but I wouldn't. So have a plan and really think it out. The truth is that most people have never spent a long time without power. And I've linked to some resources down below if you want to consider what that would be like. But think about how you plan to stay warm, cook your food, purify your water, etc. Many people can do this for a week, but as someone who's actually spent weeks at a time in the mountains before, obviously without power, it's not as easy for most people as you might think, and you should at least have a plan in case that's what happens. And keep in mind, you probably don't live in an isolated vacuum. You have neighbors, you have friends and family, and they should also have some type of a plan. You talk to your neighbors, and there's no reason to be strangers, and if they're not crazy, have a plan to watch each other's back. There's safety in numbers. Generator's great for a few days. Many people have them, especially if you live rurally, but maybe a week if you have some good fuel on hand, but if you're prepared that way. But it does get harder to manage after a few weeks have gone by. I love Washington State, and this is my home. And based on the analytics on this channel, I know that many of you watching this video also live here. We're fortunate to live in a place, particularly on the west side of the state, where the climate is so mild, losing power isn't the same level of crisis it might be for those who live further inland, and they might, have big snowstorms or ice storms. However, we should all strive to be prepared and to encourage our politicians to do the right thing. If we don't succeed in that effort, the future will be a lot more challenging for us, we the governed.